Welcome, Focus Learners. I am absolutely thrilled to have you joining me for this explainer. Today, we're going to explore a really fascinating subject that acts as a vital bridge between raw information and tangible global social progress. We're going to see how communication isn't just about sharing facts. It's actually a powerful, active tool used to empower communities and elevate the quality of life all around the world.
Okay, let's dive right into this. When we look at global underdevelopment, we're staring at a massive, incredibly complex puzzle. We're talking about poverty, health crises, educational gaps. These are monumental challenges. So how do we actually go about solving them? Well, historically, a big part of the evolving solution has been strategic messaging. It's this core idea that the right message, delivered in the right way, can actually transform an entire society.
We're going to break this complex academic history into some bite-sized chronological pieces so it's super easy to follow. First, the catalyst. Second, the first attempt. Third, the backlash. Fourth, the awakening. And finally, taking action.
All right, Section 1, the catalyst, defining development communication.
Before we jump into the historical evolution, we need to establish a clear baseline. The term we're focusing on is development communication, and it was first coined by a scholar named Nora Cabral back in 1970. She defined it as the strategic and planned use of communication methods to attain developmental goals and foster social change. This concept really emerged after World War II, and it's meant to be this practical, real-world bridge between academic knowledge and actual community enhancement, whether you're trying to improve health outcomes, agriculture, or local governance.
So the absolutely crucial point here is that this philosophy is completely distinct from general media or everyday communication. It rests on three core ideas. First, it's purpose-driven, meaning it's intentionally value-oriented and designed to inspire positive change. Second, it's goal-focused, aiming directly at driving real social and political transformation. And finally, it's holistic. It extends way beyond just improving a country's economic bottom line. It's about uplifting the social, political, cultural, and overall moral quality of life so everyday individuals can reach their full potential.
Moving on to Section 2, the first attempt, the top-down modernization era.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it maps out our historical narrative of trial, error, and eventually awakening. Early global policy tried to use media to just force modernization. But spoiler alert, they definitely didn't get it right the first time. We start post-WW2 with the dominant paradigm of modernization. Then the 1970s brings the opposing paradigm of dependency. And finally, the 1980s introduces the emerging paradigm of participation. Let's zoom in on that very first era.
The post-WW dominant paradigm was deeply rooted in this pretty arrogant belief that underdeveloped countries simply needed to mimic Western industrialized nations to succeed. Scholar Paulo Freire defined four major levels to this approach. Culturally, it assumed people should just abandon their traditions for modernity. Technocratically, it demanded strict reliance on Western science. Politically, it pushed for Western systems, and economically, it demanded the blind adoption of free market capitalism. It was an incredibly linear worldview that totally ignored local realities.
And how exactly did they communicate all this? Well, they relied heavily on a linear, top-down approach like the SMCR model, that's sender, message, channel, receiver, and what was famously known as the hypodermic needle theory. Essentially, authorities actually believed they could just inject information through mass media straight into the public consciousness. Imagine broadcasting a government radio ad about a new farming technique and simply expecting rural farmers to passively absorb it and instantly drop centuries of traditional behavior. It was incredibly flawed. They treated audiences as entirely passive receivers and vastly overestimated the persuasive power of a one-way broadcast.
Which brings us to Section 3, the backlash, the dependency theory pushback.
Unsurprisingly, that top-down approach failed to transform mindsets, and it led to a massive backlash in the 1970s. Thinkers like A.G. Frank argued that underdevelopment wasn't because these countries were somehow backward, but because they were being actively exploited by powerful nations and global capitalist systems. Thus, dependency theory was born. This theory suggested a two-tiered structural strategy for developing nations to fight back against global power imbalances. Step 1. At the national level, achieve economic self-reliance so you can reduce dependency on foreign imports. Step 2. At the international level, form alliances with other developing nations to build some real collective political muscle.
But here is the tragic irony of dependency theory in the 1970s. While they absolutely hit the nail on the head with their economic critiques of Western powers, they still completely neglected critical social and cultural factors. And honestly, even worse, when it came to communication, they relied on that exact same one-way flow of information. Sure, they changed the message and they changed who controlled the message, but they were still using the same flawed top-down megaphone. Ultimately, they failed to provide any effective methods for dealing with real, everyday grassroots challenges. Let's jump into Section 4, The Awakening, the Power of Participation. And this slide brilliantly illustrates the massive contrast we finally saw by the 1980s. It became completely clear that the megaphone wasn't working. We see a huge shift away from the old dominant paradigm on the left, which was one-way, top-down, Western-centric, and entirely focused on persuasion, and we embrace the emerging participatory paradigm on the right. This new era is two-way, it's grassroots, it's localized, and it is based entirely on dialogue. We finally recognize that you can't just tell people to develop. You have to consult with them, understand their risks, and build consensus together.
This new paradigm quite literally views development as liberation. Championed by Paulo Freire, this approach prioritizes the involvement and empowerment of individuals right in their own cultural realities. It says, hey, local, indigenous knowledge is just as valuable as modern science. Instead of bringing in outside solutions that just don't fit, it relies on locally available resources and manpower. It's uplifting, it's liberating, and it finally treats the people not as passive receivers, but as the active, beating heart of the development process.
Let's move to our final section, Section 5, Taking Action, Practical Communication Approaches. It's wonderful to have a philosophy of empowerment, but how do we actually apply this in the real world today? Well, there's no single magic bullet. There are multiple, overlapping approaches that have to be tailored to specific needs. For instance, the diffusion approach carefully introduces tech innovations based on what the community actually needs, while the mass media approach balances rural and urban messaging. The institutional approach prioritizes broad education and literacy, and the integrated approach makes sure resources are distributed evenly. Finally, the localized approach goes a step further, ensuring that the local populations are actually the ones planning and creating the communication materials themselves. The big takeaway? Everything must adapt to the specific environment. Ultimately, the whole shebang boils down to this fundamental quote: development communication fulfills two primary roles. It serves as a catalyst for change and seeks to create a supportive environment for innovations that advance societal development. Today, this field remains an incredibly powerful tool driven entirely by social responsibility. It isn't just about rural issues. It's about improving all living conditions by creating an environment where positive change is not just possible, but sustainable. And why is it sustainable? Because the people themselves are the ones driving it.
I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to ponder. Think about your own life and your own society. Are you simply receiving messages, or are you actively participating in the communication that shapes your community? When you understand the history of development communication, you realize pretty quickly that true progress only happens when we all step up to the microphone. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking great questions, and I really hope you leave today feeling inspired to engage in the dialogues that shape our world.